The room was filled with laughter. Not the warm kind laughter you'd hear among friends, but the mocking, sneering kind. Brandon, the delivery man, stood silently, his jaw clenched. A few of the employees of Nexus Incorporated had crowded near the reception desk, whispering loudly enough for him to hear. Their jokes were cutting, their words dripping with disdain. "Guess they'll just let anyone in here now," one of them snorted, eyeing Brandon's uniform. "I'm surprised he even knows how to read the address," another chimed in. Brandon had heard it all before. He was used to these kinds of comments, but today, something felt different. He wasn't just here to deliver a package. He was here for a reason they could never guess. One of them, a young man with slicked-back hair and a smug grin, took it a step further. "Hey, delivery guy. Don't scratch the walls on your way out, okay? This isn't the kind of place you're used to." The receptionist giggled nervously, her eyes darting between Brandon and the employees. Brandon simply raised an eyebrow, letting their words hang in the air like bad perfume. He knew better than to react, at least, not yet. He dropped the heavy package on the counter with a thud, causing the receptionist to jump. The sound silenced the room for a brief moment, but then someone muttered, "Wow, even clumsy." "Figures." Brandon straightened his back, towering over them now. His gaze swept over the group, his expression unreadable. "You might want to watch what you're saying," he said calmly, his voice steady. "You never know who you're talking to." A few of them smirked, others exchanged confused glances. One of them muttered under his breath, "What's he gonna do? Write a complaint?" They all burst into laughter again. Brandon didn't say another word. Instead, he gave a small knowing smile and walked out the door, leaving them to their laughter. But what they didn't realize was that their laughter would soon be wiped away. Because Brandon wasn't just the delivery man. He was the new owner of Nexus Inc. A week earlier, Brandon had been sitting in his modest living room, flipping through papers. The acquisition of Nexus Incorporated had just been finalized, and he had plans, big plans, for the company. But before he could implement changes, he wanted to see the company from the ground up. He'd always believed that to understand a business, you had to see it through the eyes of its employees. That's when he decided to visit the office incognito, posing as a delivery man. It wasn't just a test of the company's culture, it was a test of character. He wanted to see how people treated someone they thought had no power. When he first walked into the sleek, modern building, he was struck by how pristine everything looked. The floors gleamed, the walls were decorated with expensive art, and the employees bustled around in tailored suits. It was the kind of place that oozed wealth and privilege, and Brandon was curious to see if its people were as polished as its decor. The receptionist had been polite enough when he handed her the first package. She gave him a professional smile, though her eyes quickly darted back to her computer screen, as if dismissing him the moment he was out of sight. Brandon didn't mind. It wasn't her reaction he was here for. But then the group of employees had approached. At first, it was just idle chatter, a comment here or there about the package he was carrying. Then, the tone shifted. They began making jokes, not so subtle digs about his appearance, his uniform, and even his presence in their pristine office. Brandon kept his expression neutral, but inside, he was taking mental notes. These weren't just employees, they were managers, leaders within the company. And their behavior spoke volumes about the culture they fostered. He had no intention of letting their comments slide, but he also wasn't going to confront them just yet. He wanted to see how far they'd go, how deep their prejudice ran. As he left the office that day, his mind was already racing with ideas. He had always believed in giving people a chance to redeem themselves, but there were limits. Some lessons had to be taught the hard way. The next day, Brandon returned, this time with another delivery. He noticed the same group lingering near the reception desk, their laughter echoing through the hall. "Back again," one of them sneered. Brandon nodded, keeping his voice calm. "Got another delivery for you. Careful not to trip over your own feet," one of them joked, earning another round of laughter. As he set the package down, he noticed one employee, a woman in her mid-30s, watching from a distance. She seemed uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Brandon and her colleagues. But she didn't say anything. Brandon wondered if she wanted to speak up but felt pressured to stay silent. He made a mental note to find out more about her later. As he turned to leave, one of the employees called out, "Don't forget to pick up the trash on your way out." The group erupted into laughter again, their voices echoing in the grand lobby. Brandon paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He turned back, his gaze locking onto the man who had made the comment. For a moment, the laughter died down as the two men stared at each other. Brandon didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The weight of his silence spoke volumes. The man shifted uncomfortably, but then quickly masked it with another smirk. What? Got something to say? Brandon smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not yet, he said. Then he walked out the door. But inside, he knew the moment was coming. The moment when they'd all realize who he really was. And when that moment came, their laughter would be replaced with something else entirely. The receptionist glanced nervously at the group after Brandon left. Do you think he'll complain? She asked quietly. Complain about what? The smug man replied, leaning against the counter. It's not like he can do anything. He's just a delivery guy. But the woman who had been watching from a distance finally spoke up. Maybe you shouldn't underestimate people, she said softly. Her comment was met with scoffs and dismissive chuckles, but Brandon's words lingered in her mind. You never know who you're talking to. Little did they know, their world was about to turn upside down. The following Monday started like any other at Nexus Incorporated. The employees bustled about, preparing for a meeting scheduled with someone they only knew as the new owner. Rumors had been swirling since the announcement of the acquisition, but no one had seen the mysterious figure yet. Brandon arrived early, once again dressed in his delivery uniform. This time, he carried no packages. Instead, he observed the office quietly, watching the employees prepare for what they assumed would be a pivotal day for the company. He noticed the same group that had mocked him last week. They were standing near the coffee machine, talking about the upcoming meeting. Bet the new boss is some rich guy with no idea how we actually run things, one of them said. I just hope he's not some micromanager, another replied. The smug man from before, his name was Todd, chimed in. Doesn't matter who it is. They'll probably just sit in their fancy office all day and let us do the real work. Brandon smirked to himself. If only they knew. As the clock ticked closer to the meeting, the atmosphere in the office grew tense. Employees were straightening their ties, touching up their makeup, and reviewing their notes. Brandon walked around, unnoticed by most, until he reached the woman he'd noticed during his previous visit. Excuse me, he said softly. She looked up from her desk, startled. Her name tag read Emily. She hesitated for a moment before responding. Oh hi. Can I help you? Brandon leaned in slightly. You were the only one who didn't laugh last week, he said, keeping his voice low. Why? Emily's cheeks flushed, and she glanced around to make sure no one was listening. I didn't think it was right, she admitted. But it's hard to speak up around here. People like Todd, they don't make it easy. Brandon nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for your honesty, he said. I'll remember that. Emily looked confused, but before she could ask anything, Todd's voice rang out from across the room. Hey, delivery guy. Didn't expect to see you again. Didn't they fire you for scaring the receptionist? His comment drew a few chuckles from his usual group. Brandon turned to face him, his expression calm. Just here for the meeting, he said simply. The laughter stopped abruptly. The meeting? Todd repeated, frowning. Why would a delivery guy be in the meeting? Brandon didn't answer. Instead, he made his way to the conference room, leaving a trail of whispers behind him. The conference room was a sight to behold, with its long glass table, state-of-the-art technology, and a stunning view of the city skyline. The employees filed in one by one, their chatter growing louder as they speculated about the new owner. Brandon stood at the far end of the room, observing them silently. A few of them glanced at him with confusion, clearly wondering why the delivery man was present. Todd was the last to enter, and when he saw Brandon, he rolled his eyes dramatically. What is he doing here? Todd muttered under his breath to one of his colleagues. Before anyone could respond, the door opened, and the receptionist walked in, carrying a stack of papers. The new owner will be joining us shortly, she announced nervously. Todd snorted. Great. Let's hope they're not as clueless as our friend over there, he said, jerking his thumb in Brandon's direction. Brandon stayed quiet, letting the moment build. He could see the impatience on their faces, the eagerness to meet the person they assumed would dictate their futures. When the receptionist glanced at Brandon and gave him a small nod, he knew it was time. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. Good morning, everyone, he began, his voice steady. I'm Brandon Carter, the new owner of Nexus Incorporated. The room fell silent. For a moment, it was as if time itself had stopped. Todd's face turned a shade of red, so deep it could have matched a fire truck. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Wait, what?" one of the employees finally stammered. Brandon took a step closer to the table, his gaze sweeping over the room. "Yes, you heard correctly. I'm not a delivery man. I'm your new boss." The room exploded into murmurs. Some employees looked embarrassed, others confused. Todd looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Brandon raised a hand, silencing the room. "I decided to visit the company in disguise to see how things operate on the ground level," he explained. "And what I saw was eye-opening." His gaze lingered on Todd for a moment longer than necessary, making the man squirm in his seat. "There were some of you," Brandon continued, his eyes moving to Emily, "who showed kindness and professionalism, even in small ways. But there were others who made judgments based on appearances, who treated someone they thought had no power with disrespect." The tension in the room was palpable. Brandon let his words hang in the air, letting the weight of them sink in. Then, with a small smile, he added, "We'll be addressing that soon." After the meeting, the employees dispersed quickly, most of them avoiding eye contact with Brandon. Todd was among the first to leave, muttering something under his breath about needing fresh air. Brandon returned to his office, his real office this time, and began reviewing files. He had already made a list of changes he wanted to implement, but first, he had a few one-on-one meetings to schedule. Emily was the first name on his list. He wanted to understand more about her experience at Nexus and why she had felt silenced. But he also had plans for Todd and the others. Lessons needed to be learned, and he intended to ensure they were. As he leaned back in his chair, Brandon allowed himself a small smile. The first step was complete, but there was much more work to do. And he was ready for it. The atmosphere in the office was tense. Whispers spread like wildfire, and the usual chatter by the coffee machine had turned into hushed speculation. Todd's group, once the loudest and most confident in the office, now seemed subdued. Every time Brandon walked by, their conversations stopped mid-sentence. Todd, however, was not one to back down easily. In his corner office, he paced back and forth, his mind racing. "This has to be some kind of joke," he muttered to himself. "There's no way that guy is the boss." One of his colleagues, Lisa, stood awkwardly by his desk. "Maybe we should just apologize," she suggested, her voice hesitant. Todd scoffed. "Apologize? For what? A few harmless jokes? That guy probably doesn't even know how to run a company. He's just another lucky break story." Lisa looked unconvinced but didn't argue. Todd's stubbornness was legendary, and trying to reason with him often felt like talking to a brick wall. Meanwhile, Brandon was sitting in his office, reviewing employee files. The stack of papers in front of him detailed the performance reviews, disciplinary actions, and project contributions of the Nexus team. He had a clear vision for the company, but to implement it, he needed to understand who he could count on, and who needed a reality check. Emily's file caught his attention first. She had been with the company for 5 years and had consistently received positive reviews for her work ethic and creativity. Yet, despite her contributions, she had never been promoted. Brandon frowned, making a mental note to ask her about it during their meeting. Next, he pulled Todd's file. As he skimmed through the pages, his frown deepened. Todd's performance reviews painted a picture of someone who was competent but arrogant. There were multiple complaints from colleagues about his behavior, though none of them had escalated far enough to result in serious consequences. Brandon tapped his pen against the desk, thinking. Todd was clearly talented, but his attitude was toxic. If left unchecked, it could poison the entire workplace culture. Later that afternoon, Brandon called Emily into his office. She looked nervous as she stepped inside, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Have a seat," Brandon said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Emily sat down, her posture stiff. Is everything okay?" she asked hesitantly. Brandon smiled gently. "Relax, Emily. This isn't about you being in trouble. In fact, I wanted to thank you." Emily blinked in surprise. "Thank me? For what?" "For staying professional last week," Brandon replied. "I noticed you didn't join in with the others. That took courage." Emily's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands. "I just didn't think it was right," she admitted. "But I didn't speak up, either. I feel like I should have." Brandon nodded. It's not always easy to speak up, especially in an environment where certain behaviors are normalized. But the fact that you even resisted joining in speaks to your character. He leaned forward, his expression serious. Tell me something, Emily. Have you ever felt like your voice wasn't heard in this company? Emily hesitated, then nodded slowly. Sometimes, she said. I've had ideas for projects or suggestions for improvements, but it always feels like they get brushed aside. Especially by people like Todd. Brandon's jaw tightened at her words. Thank you for being honest, he said. Things are going to change around here. And I want you to know that your voice matters. Emily looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. Thank you, Mr. Carter. That means a lot. Call me Brandon, he said with a smile. As Emily left the office, she felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in years. Maybe things really would change. Meanwhile, Todd was brewing his own plan. He had gathered his usual group in a corner of the break room, speaking in hushed tones. I'm telling you, there's no way this guy knows what he's doing, Todd said, his voice low but firm. We've been running this company just fine without him. If he thinks he can waltz in here and start calling the shots, he's got another thing coming. What are you suggesting? One of his colleagues asked nervously. We show him that this place doesn't run on luck, Todd said. It runs on people like us. If he wants to lead, he needs to prove he can keep up. The others exchanged uncertain glances, but Todd's confidence was contagious. By the end of the conversation, they had all agreed to make things as difficult as possible for Brandon. The next morning, Brandon arrived to find his email inbox flooded with unnecessary requests and vague complaints. Every minor issue seemed to have been escalated to his attention, and employees were conveniently forgetting to include crucial details in their reports. Brandon quickly realized what was happening. It was an attempt to overwhelm him, to make him feel out of his depth. But instead of getting frustrated, he saw it as an opportunity. He began responding to each email with precision, asking for clarifications and providing detailed instructions. When employees tried to catch him off guard in meetings, he countered their questions with thoughtful answers that left them scrambling. The more Todd's group tried to rattle him, the more Brandon showed them just how prepared he was. His calm demeanor and sharp mind were unshakable, and it didn't take long for the office to notice. By the end of the week, Todd was fuming. His plan to undermine Brandon had backfired, and now the new boss was earning respect from employees who had previously dismissed him. But Todd wasn't ready to give up. As he sat in his office, staring at his computer screen, a new idea began to form in his mind. If Brandon wanted to play the long game, Todd was ready to up the stakes. As the day ended and employees began packing up for the weekend, Brandon stayed behind in his office, going over his notes. He had made progress, but he knew the battle was far from over. Todd's behavior wasn't just a personal issue, it was a symptom of a larger problem within the company's culture. Brandon leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with plans. He wasn't just here to run Nexus Incorporated, he was here to change it. And no matter how many obstacles Todd and his group threw his way, he was ready to face them head-on. But as he prepared to leave for the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that Todd was planning something bigger. Something that could push this conflict to a whole new level. The following week began with a storm of tension. Todd was noticeably absent from the morning meeting, and Brandon couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was brewing. While the rest of the office settled into their routines, Brandon kept a watchful eye on his inbox, half expecting trouble to show up in one form or another. By midday, trouble arrived. Brandon was reviewing some performance reports when his assistant, Sarah, knocked lightly on the door. Brandon, you might want to see this, she said, holding up her tablet. What is it? Brandon asked, his brows furrowing. Sarah handed over the device, her expression a mix of concern and annoyance. On the screen was an anonymous post circulating among employees. It accused Brandon of being an unqualified owner who had bought his way into the company and didn't understand the industry. The post was filled with subtle jabs and outright lies, claiming he was already planning layoffs and cost cuts that would destroy Nexus Inc. Where is this coming from? Brandon asked, his voice calm but sharp. No one knows for sure, Sarah replied. But the timing is suspicious. Todd's been acting strange, and he hasn't shown up today. Brandon nodded, handing the tablet back. Thank you, Sarah. Keep an eye on this for me. I'll handle it. As the day went on, the post caused a ripple effect throughout the office. Employees were whispering in hallways, glancing at Brandon with wary eyes. Some even approached him directly, asking about the rumors. Brandon took each question in stride, addressing concerns with honesty and transparency. "There are no layoffs planned," he assured them. "I'm here to build this company up, not tear it down." But despite his efforts, the seed of doubt had been planted, and Brandon knew exactly whose hand had buried it. That evening, Todd finally made his appearance, strolling into the office as if he owned the place. Brandon watched from his office window as Todd laughed with a few of his usual allies, his smug demeanor fully intact. Brandon decided it was time for a conversation. He walked out of his office and approached Todd directly. "Good evening, Todd," Brandon said, his tone polite but firm. "Do you have a moment to talk?" Todd raised an eyebrow, his smirk barely concealed. "Of course, Mr. Carter," he replied, emphasizing the title with a hint of mockery. "What can I do for you?" Brandon gestured toward a nearby conference room. "Let's step inside." Once the door was closed, Brandon turned to face Todd. "I want to address the anonymous post circulating around the office," he said. "I assume you've seen it?" Todd leaned casually against the table, his expression unreadable. "I might have heard about it," he said with a shrug. "It's hard to keep track of these things." Brandon studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Let me be clear," he said. "I have no interest in playing games. If you have concerns about my leadership, you're welcome to address them directly. But spreading false information and creating a hostile environment won't be tolerated." Todd's smirk faltered for a split second before returning. "I don't know what you're implying," he said. "But it sounds like you're accusing me of something I didn't do." Brandon's gaze remained steady. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm giving you an opportunity to come clean." Todd straightened, his tone turning defensive. "Look, I don't know who wrote that post, but maybe you should consider that some people aren't thrilled about the changes you're planning. That's not my fault." Brandon nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Fair enough," he said. "But let me give you a piece of advice, Todd. Change is inevitable, and how you handle it will determine your future here." With that, Brandon walked out of the room, leaving Todd standing alone. The next day, Brandon called an all-hands meeting. The employees gathered in the conference room, their curiosity piqued. Todd sat near the back, arms crossed, his expression one of thinly veiled irritation. Brandon stood at the front of the room, his posture confident. "Good morning, everyone," he began. "I want to address the rumors that have been circulating. I believe in transparency, so I'll be upfront with you." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I did not acquire Nexus Incorporated to dismantle it. My goal is to strengthen this company, to create an environment where everyone can thrive. But to do that, we need to be honest with ourselves about the culture we've built here." The room was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on him. "There are behaviors that need to change," Brandon continued. "Not just for the sake of the company, but for the sake of the people who work here. This isn't about pointing fingers, it's about creating a workplace where respect and collaboration are the norm." He glanced toward Todd briefly before continuing. "I'm committed to making Nexus Incorporated a better place for everyone. But that requires cooperation and accountability. If anyone has concerns, my door is always open. Let's work together to move forward." As the meeting ended, murmurs filled the room. Some employees seemed reassured, while others remained skeptical. Todd, however, looked unfazed. If anything, he seemed more determined than ever. Later that afternoon, Brandon received an unexpected visit from Emily. She hesitated in the doorway, clutching a folder to her chest. "Do you have a minute?" she asked softly. "Of course," Brandon said, gesturing for her to sit. Emily placed the folder on his desk. "I think you should see this," she said. "It's about Todd." Brandon opened the folder and scanned its contents. Inside were emails and memos that painted a damning picture of Todd's behavior. He had not only dismissed Emily's ideas, but had also taken credit for some of them. There were also complaints from other employees about his bullying and manipulative tactics. "Thank you for bringing this to me," Brandon said, his voice steady. "This is exactly the kind of behavior we need to address." Emily nodded, her expression a mix of relief and apprehension. I hope things really do change," she said. "They will," Brandon assured her. "You have my word." As Emily left, Brandon leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Todd's behavior had gone unchecked for far too long, but now Brandon had the evidence he needed. It was time to take action. That evening, as the office emptied out, Brandon began drafting a plan. Todd's arrogance had created a toxic ripple effect, and it was clear that his influence couldn't be allowed to continue unchecked. But Brandon knew Todd wouldn't go down without a fight. And as he prepared for the days ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that the next move would be Todd's. Whatever it was, Brandon intended to be ready. By Wednesday morning, the tension at Nexus Incorporated was palpable. The anonymous post was still the talk of the office, and Todd had doubled down on his smug demeanor, walking around as though he were untouchable. Meanwhile, Brandon's every move was being closely watched, not just by Todd, but by employees who were beginning to pick sides. Brandon remained calm, keeping his strategy close to his chest. He spent the early part of the day meeting with team leaders to assess the morale and uncover hidden issues. Most were professional, but a few avoided eye contact, clearly nervous about how much he knew. As Brandon wrapped up his final meeting before lunch, his assistant Sarah appeared at his door, looking uneasy. "Brandon," she said, "you're going to want to see this." She handed him her tablet again, this time displaying an email thread that had been forwarded anonymously to her. The subject line read, "Taking back control." Brandon's brow furrowed as he scanned the emails. Todd had been organizing a covert meeting with his close allies, discussing ways to expose Brandon as unfit to lead the company. The language was manipulative, with phrases like "he's all talk," "we know the business better," and "it's time to show who really runs this place." The emails didn't just hint at dissent, they were a full-fledged plan to undermine Brandon's leadership. And from the looks of it, Todd's group was already putting parts of the plan into motion. Brandon placed the tablet down slowly. "Did we trace where this came from?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "It came from an anonymous account, but the writing is, well, let's just say it's not hard to figure out who's behind it." Brandon leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Todd was clearly escalating things, and it was time to take control. But Brandon didn't want to overreact. He needed to handle this strategically, in a way that wouldn't just neutralize Todd but also send a clear message to the rest of the office. "Thank you, Sarah," he said. "I'll handle it." Later that afternoon, Brandon made an unexpected appearance on the office floor. Employees looked up from their desks as he walked through, his expression calm but focused. "Excuse me, everyone," Brandon said, his voice carrying across the room. "Can I have your attention for a moment?" The chatter died down as employees turned to face him. Todd, who had been lounging near the coffee machine, straightened up, his eyes narrowing. "I wanted to address something important," Brandon continued. "I've received information that certain individuals are spreading rumors and attempting to create division within this company. Let me be clear, this kind of behavior is not acceptable." His gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Todd, whose jaw tightened. "I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame," Brandon said. "But I will say this, if anyone has concerns or ideas, my door is open. I encourage open dialogue. However, attempts to sabotage the workplace will be dealt with swiftly." The room was silent, tension hanging thick in the air. Brandon let his words sink in before adding, "I believe in this company, and I believe in the people who work here. Let's focus on moving forward together." As Brandon walked away, the employees exchanged nervous glances. Todd, however, remained rooted in place, his fists clenched at his sides. That evening, Brandon stayed late in his office, reviewing his options. He had evidence of Todd's behavior, but he wanted to handle the situation in a way that wouldn't alienate the rest of the staff. Todd was well liked by some, and an outright dismissal could create more division. Instead, Brandon decided to shift his focus. He would use the situation as an opportunity to rebuild trust and reshape the company's culture. But first, he needed to confront Todd directly. The next morning, Brandon called Todd into his office. Todd entered with a confident swagger, but Brandon could see the tension in his eyes. "You wanted to see me?" Todd asked, taking a seat without being invited. "Yes," Brandon said, leaning forward on his desk. "I want to talk about your behavior." Todd raised an eyebrow. "My behavior? What's that supposed to mean?" Brandon slid the forwarded email thread across the desk. "This," he said simply. Todd's face darkened as he scanned the document. "This is ridiculous," he said, slamming the papers back onto the desk. "I didn't write this." Brandon's gaze remained steady. "The language is consistent with other complaints I've received about you," he said. "And regardless of whether you wrote it or not, the fact remains that you've created an environment where this kind of behavior thrives." Todd bristled, his tone turning defensive. I've done nothing but work hard for this company. If anyone's creating division, it's you, coming in here and acting like you know everything. Brandon leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. Todd, I'm not here to argue. I'm here to give you an opportunity. You can either take responsibility and work with me to improve this company, or you can continue down this path. But I'll warn you, the latter won't end well. Todd stood abruptly, his face red with anger. You can't talk to me like that, he snapped. You don't know anything about what it takes to run this place. Brandon remained unfazed. That's your decision, he said. But remember, every choice has consequences. Todd stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Later that afternoon, Brandon received a visitor, Emily. She looked nervous but determined as she stepped into his office. I wanted to thank you, she said, for standing up for the people who've been ignored around here. It means a lot. Brandon smiled. Thank you, Emily. But the real change is going to come from people like you, those who care about creating a better environment. Emily hesitated for a moment before saying, if there's anything I can do to help, let me know. There is, Brandon said. Keep being honest, and don't let anyone silence you. As Emily left, Brandon felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. Todd's resistance was just the beginning, but Brandon was determined to show everyone, through his actions, that he was the kind of leader Nexus Incorporated needed. The day ended with a sense of quiet unease. Todd's stormy departure had not gone unnoticed, and employees whispered about what might come next. But Brandon stayed focused, his resolve stronger than ever. He wasn't here to tear anyone down, he was here to build something better. And he knew that sometimes, the hardest battles led to the most meaningful victories. The storm finally broke on Friday morning. Brandon arrived at the office to find Sarah waiting for him outside his door, her face a mask of urgency. You'll want to see this, she said, handing him her tablet once more. This time, the stakes had escalated. A second anonymous email had surfaced, this one more aggressive. It accused Brandon of nepotism, claimed he had no industry experience, and suggested that he'd inherited the company through dubious means. It also hinted at fabricated financial issues, warning employees that their jobs might not be safe for long. The email spread like wildfire, with employees huddled in groups, their hushed conversations punctuated by occasional glances toward Brandon's office. Brandon scanned the email, his expression calm but his mind racing. The accusations were baseless, but the damage to morale was undeniable. Todd had made his move. Sarah, Brandon said, handing the tablet back, schedule a meeting with the entire staff. I'll address this head-on. By mid-morning, the entire company gathered in the same conference room where Brandon had first introduced himself. The energy in the room was tense, and Todd sat near the back, leaning casually against his chair with a smirk that didn't escape Brandon's notice. Brandon stepped forward, his posture relaxed but commanding. He held up a printed copy of the email and addressed the room. I'm sure most of you have seen this, he began. Another anonymous email filled with accusations and warnings. Let me set the record straight. He paused, letting his gaze move across the room. I acquired Nexus Incorporated because I see its potential. I didn't inherit it. I wasn't handed it. I bought it with my own resources, earned through years of hard work and leadership in other industries. The room was silent, the employees hanging on his every word. As for the financial stability of this company, let me be absolutely clear, Nexus Incorporated is in no danger. Your jobs are secure, and anyone suggesting otherwise is spreading misinformation. Brandon turned to address the deeper issue. But this email isn't just about me. It's about the culture we've built here. Someone, anonymously, is trying to divide us, to create fear and distrust. That's not the kind of workplace I want to lead. And I know it's not the kind of workplace you want to be part of. His gaze shifted briefly to Todd, whose smirk had faded into a tight-lipped frown. To whoever wrote this, Brandon continued, I invite you to come to me directly. My door is open, and I welcome honest dialogue. But let me make one thing clear, divisive and underhanded tactics have no place here. Brandon's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then slowly, a ripple of applause began. It started with Emily, who clapped confidently from her seat, and soon others joined in. Even employees who had been skeptical seemed moved by Brandon's transparency and leadership. Todd, however, remained stone-faced, his hands firmly in his lap. Later that day, Brandon called an impromptu meeting with the company's HR team and legal counsel. He presented the emails and shared his suspicions about Todd's involvement. "We need to proceed carefully," Brandon said. "I don't want to accuse anyone without concrete evidence, but we can't ignore the impact this is having." The HR manager, a no-nonsense woman named Diane, nodded. "We'll start an internal investigation. If Todd's behind this, we'll find out." "Good," Brandon said. "In the meantime, I want to focus on repairing morale. We need to remind the team that this company is about collaboration, not division." While the investigation quietly moved forward, Brandon shifted his attention to the employees who had been overlooked and undervalued under Todd's influence. He began holding one-on-one meetings, listening to their concerns and ideas. It didn't take long for him to identify rising stars within the company, people like Emily, whose creativity and dedication had gone unrecognized for far too long. Brandon also implemented new policies to encourage transparency and accountability. Weekly team check-ins became mandatory, and an anonymous feedback system was introduced, allowing employees to voice their concerns without fear of retribution. The changes didn't go unnoticed. Employees who had initially been wary of Brandon's leadership began to warm up to him, realizing that he genuinely cared about their well-being and the company's future. Meanwhile, Todd grew increasingly agitated. His attempts to undermine Brandon had failed to produce the chaos he'd hoped for, and the growing support for Brandon only fueled his frustration. In his mind, Brandon was still an outsider, someone who didn't belong. One evening, as Todd sat alone in his office, he made a decision. If subtlety wasn't working, he'd take a more direct approach. His plan was risky, but Todd was convinced it would finally expose Brandon as unfit to lead. The next morning, Nexus Incorporated was buzzing with excitement. Brandon had announced a company-wide brainstorming session to gather ideas for future growth. Employees were energized by the opportunity to contribute directly to the company's vision. But as the session began, an unexpected interruption occurred. Todd stood up in the middle of the room, his voice cutting through the chatter. "I have something to say," Todd declared, his tone sharp. All eyes turned to him, and the room fell silent. Brandon, standing at the front of the room, raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead, Todd." Todd smirked, his confidence returning as he faced the room. "I think it's time we talked about the real issues in this company. Like how we've been misled by someone who has no experience in our industry." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, and Brandon's expression remained calm. He gestured for Todd to continue. Todd turned to the employees, his voice growing louder. "Brandon Carter wants us to believe he's here to save Nexus Incorporated, but let's be honest, he doesn't know what he's doing. He's just another outsider playing pretend while the rest of us do the real work." The tension in the room was thick, and all eyes were on Brandon. Todd crossed his arms, a triumphant look on his face. Brandon let the moment hang in the air before responding. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of steel in his tone. "Thank you, Todd," Brandon said. "You've made your opinion clear. Now let's see if you're willing to back it up with facts." Todd blinked, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" Brandon stepped forward, addressing the room. "Todd has raised some serious concerns about my leadership. So, let's put everything on the table. I'm inviting all of you to share your thoughts, honestly and openly. If there are real issues, I want to address them. But let's keep it professional." The employees exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to proceed. Todd, for the first time, seemed unsure of himself. Brandon turned to Todd directly. "You wanted to have this conversation, Todd. So let's have it. Right here, right now." The room held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Todd's confidence wavered, and for the first time, he realized he might have underestimated Brandon. Todd stood frozen, his earlier bravado fading under the weight of the moment. The room was deathly quiet, all eyes flicking between Todd and Brandon. Todd's smirk twitched, trying to regain its footing. "Fine," he said, crossing his arms defensively. "You want facts? Let's talk facts." He turned toward the employees, gesturing broadly. "How many of you have seen actual results since Brandon took over? We've been spinning in circles, new policies, endless meetings, and promises of change, but where's the proof? All I see is a lot of talk and no action." A few employees murmured uncomfortably, unsure whether to agree or stay silent. Brandon stood calmly, letting Todd air his grievances. He could feel the tension in the room rising, but he wasn't going to interrupt. Todd was digging his own hole. And let's not forget, Todd continued, his voice gaining momentum, he didn't build this company. We did. We've been here, day in and day out, making Nexus Incorporated what it is. He just waltzes in here with his money and expects us to bow down like he's some kind of savior. Todd turned to Brandon, his expression triumphant. So tell us, Brandon, what exactly qualifies you to lead this company? What have you actually done that we should respect? Brandon stepped forward, his expression composed but firm. I'm glad you asked, Todd, he said. Because it's time we cleared the air. Brandon addressed the employees directly, his voice steady and clear. First, let me acknowledge something important. You're right, Todd. I didn't build this company. You did. Every person in this room has contributed to the success of Nexus Incorporated, and that's something I deeply respect. His words softened the tension slightly, and a few employees nodded in agreement. But let me also say this, Brandon continued, his tone sharpening. Leadership isn't about who's been here the longest or who shouts the loudest. It's about making decisions that benefit the entire team, even when they're not easy or popular. He gestured toward the group. Since I've taken over, I've been listening to your concerns, your frustrations, and your ideas. I've met with many of you one-on-one to understand what's working and what's not. And while change takes time, I'm committed to building a company culture that values respect, collaboration, and innovation. Brandon's eyes locked onto Todd. But respect isn't a one-way street. It's not earned by tearing others down or spreading rumors. It's earned through accountability, integrity, and a willingness to work together. Todd opened his mouth to respond, but Brandon cut him off. And speaking of accountability, he said, his voice rising slightly, I've been reviewing some interesting documents over the past few days. Documents that paint a troubling picture of how some employees have been treated under your leadership. Gasps rippled through the room. Todd's confident posture faltered as Brandon reached for a folder on the table. These emails, Brandon said, holding them up, show a pattern of behavior that goes against everything Nexus Incorporated should stand for. Taking credit for others' ideas. Dismissing valid concerns. Creating a toxic environment where people are afraid to speak up. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Todd, this isn't just about me. This is about the kind of company we want to be. And the kind of leader you've been. The room was electric with tension, the employees glancing at Todd with a mix of shock and discomfort. Todd's face had turned a deep shade of red, his earlier confidence now replaced with indignation. This is ridiculous, Todd sputtered. You can't just pin everything on me. I've done more for this company than anyone else here. Brandon raised an eyebrow. I'm not pinning anything, Todd. I'm presenting facts. And if you'd like to challenge them, we can have that conversation. But it's clear to me, and to many others, that your actions have hurt this company more than they've helped. Todd's fists clenched at his sides. You think you're better than me? Just because you bought this place, you think you can waltz in and play hero? Brandon took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. This isn't about being a hero, Todd. It's about being a leader. And leadership isn't about power, it's about responsibility. He turned back to the employees. I'm not here to be perfect. I'm here to learn, to listen, and to lead us toward a better future. But I can't do that alone. I need all of you to be part of that journey. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, Emily stood up. I believe in what Brandon's trying to do, she said, her voice steady. He's already made me feel heard in a way I never have before. Another employee, a younger man from marketing, raised his hand. Same here, he said. It feels like things are finally moving in the right direction. One by one, employees began to speak up, sharing their thoughts and experiences. Some were hesitant, others passionate, but the message was clear, they were ready for change, and they believed Brandon could bring it. Todd, now visibly shaken, sank back into his chair, his earlier bravado completely gone. After the meeting, Brandon returned to his office, feeling both relieved and energized. The confrontation with Todd had been intense, but it had also been a turning point. For the first time, he felt like the employees were beginning to trust him, not just as their boss, but as a leader. Later that afternoon, Diane from HR knocked on his door. We've completed our investigation, she said, handing him a report. It's worse than we thought. Brandon skimmed the report, his jaw tightening. The findings included multiple instances of misconduct by Todd, including harassment, manipulation, and abuse of power. "Thank you, Diane," Brandon said. "Let's schedule a meeting with legal. It's time to take the next step." That evening, as the office emptied out, Todd sat alone in his corner, staring blankly at his computer screen. He knew his time was running out, but he wasn't ready to go quietly. Not yet. Brandon, meanwhile, sat in his office, going over plans for the next phase of his leadership. He knew the battle with Todd wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. The employees deserved a workplace they could be proud of, and Brandon was determined to deliver it, no matter the cost. Monday morning arrived with a quiet tension that permeated the entire office. The results of the HR investigation had not been made public yet, but whispers were beginning to circulate. Employees sensed that something big was about to happen. Brandon arrived earlier than usual, determined to prepare for the week ahead. The report on Todd's misconduct sat on his desk like a ticking time bomb. Today would be the day to act, but he wanted to ensure he approached the situation thoughtfully. Nexus Incorporated was already on shaky ground, and mishandling Todd's removal could send the wrong message to the rest of the team. Todd, on the other hand, had doubled down on his arrogance. Despite the mounting evidence against him, he strutted through the office with a false sense of security. He was certain that Brandon wouldn't dare fire him. Todd was, after all, one of the company's most experienced managers. His network within the industry was extensive, and he believed that his connections would make him untouchable. In his mind, Todd was already planning his next move. He would position himself as the true leader of Nexus Incorporated, a beacon of stability compared to Brandon's outsider leadership. All he needed was one final play to tip the scales in his favor. By mid-morning, Brandon called an all-hands meeting. The email invitation was brief, simply stating, "Company update. Attendance mandatory." The conference room filled quickly, employees exchanging nervous glances as they settled into their seats. Todd entered last, his smug confidence intact, though his eyes briefly darted toward Brandon with a flicker of uncertainty. Brandon stood at the head of the table, his expression calm but serious. "Good morning, everyone," he began. "I've called this meeting to address some important matters regarding the future of Nexus Incorporated." He paused, his gaze moving across the room. "Over the past few weeks, we've faced challenges, both internal and external. And while I'm proud of the progress we've made, there are issues that need to be addressed openly and directly." The room was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on Brandon. "First, I want to reaffirm my commitment to this company and to all of you. My goal has always been to build a workplace where everyone feels valued and respected. Unfortunately, we've identified behaviors and practices that don't align with those values." Brandon held up the report from HR, his tone measured. "After a thorough investigation, we've uncovered clear evidence of misconduct by one of our senior managers. This includes harassment, manipulation, and creating a toxic work environment." A ripple of shock spread through the room, though some employees glanced knowingly at Todd. Todd's confident facade cracked slightly, his jaw tightening. Brandon continued, "As a result, effective immediately, Todd Bennett will no longer be employed at Nexus Incorporated." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted, followed by a tense silence. Todd shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "You can't do this," Todd shouted. "I've given years to this company. You don't know what you're doing." Brandon remained calm, his gaze steady. "This decision wasn't made lightly, Todd. But the evidence speaks for itself, and the well-being of this team is my priority." Todd's fists clenched, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out further. But then he looked around the room, noticing the lack of support from his colleagues. Even those who had been part of his inner circle avoided his gaze. Realizing he was defeated, Todd grabbed his things and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The tension in the room lingered as Brandon turned back to the employees. "I know this news may come as a shock," he said. "But I want you all to know that this is a turning point for Nexus Incorporated. My goal is to create a culture where accountability and respect are the foundation of everything we do." He paused, his voice softening. "Change is never easy, but it's necessary. And I'm committed to working with each of you to make this company the best it can be." Emily was the first to speak, her voice steady. "Thank you, Brandon. I think I can speak for a lot of us when I say we appreciate your honesty and leadership." A murmur of agreement spread through the room, and the atmosphere began to shift. While the tension hadn't completely dissipated, there was a sense of relief among the employees, a feeling that things might finally improve. Later that day, Brandon called Emily into his office. "I wanted to thank you for your support," he said. "You've been a big part of helping me understand what needs to change around here." Emily smiled. "I just want to see this company succeed. And I believe in what you're trying to do." Brandon nodded. "I've been reviewing your work, and it's clear that you've contributed a lot to this team. I'd like to offer you a promotion to Senior Project Manager. I think you're ready for the role." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Brandon said with a smile. "You've earned it." Emily nodded, a look of determination crossing her face. "Yes. Thank you, Brandon. I won't let you down." As the day ended, the office felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Employees were beginning to talk openly about their ideas and concerns, and the atmosphere was becoming more collaborative. Brandon knew there was still work to be done, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Removing Todd had been a difficult decision, but it was the right one. Now he could focus on building the kind of workplace he had envisioned, a place where respect, integrity, and teamwork thrived. But as Brandon sat in his office that evening, reviewing plans for the company's future, his phone buzzed with an unexpected message. The name on the screen made his stomach tighten. It was Todd. And the message simply read, "This isn't over." Brandon leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Todd might have been removed from Nexus Incorporated, but it seemed he wasn't ready to let go. Whatever Todd had planned next, Brandon knew he'd have to be ready for it. Brandon stared at the message on his phone, Todd's words echoing in his mind, "This isn't over." It was vague but menacing enough to put Brandon on high alert. He had expected some resistance from Todd, but the direct threat signaled that Todd wasn't going to bow out quietly. Deciding not to respond, Brandon placed his phone down and refocused on his work. Whatever Todd was planning, Brandon would deal with it strategically, just as he had everything else. The next morning, Brandon arrived at the office to find Sarah waiting for him with a concerned expression. "Brandon, we have a problem," she said, handing him her tablet. On the screen was a blog post from a popular industry website, its headline blaring, "Scandal at Nexus Incorporated. New leadership faces allegations of corruption and incompetence." The article was filled with anonymous quotes from supposed insiders at Nexus, painting Brandon as an unqualified leader who had inherited his position through nepotism. It also claimed the company was in financial trouble and hinted at internal unrest. Brandon's stomach tightened as he read through the article. The language was eerily similar to the anonymous emails that had circulated within the company. It didn't take much to guess who was behind it. "Have you spoken to anyone about this yet?" Brandon asked Sarah. "Not yet," she replied. "But people are already talking. Some are worried this could hurt the company's reputation, or worse." Brandon nodded. "Thank you for bringing this to me. I'll address it." Brandon called an emergency meeting with the executive team. The room was filled with murmurs as the leaders of Nexus Incorporated gathered, many of them visibly uneasy. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Brandon began, standing at the head of the table. "I'm sure most of you have seen the article that was published this morning. Let me start by saying that the allegations are completely false." He held up a printed copy of the article. "This is not journalism. It's an attack on our company, and on me personally. Whoever is behind it is trying to undermine the progress we've been making." One of the executives, a man named Greg, raised his hand. "Do we know who's responsible?" "We don't have concrete evidence yet," Brandon admitted. "But given the timing and the language used, I have strong suspicions." Another executive, Diane from HR, leaned forward. "What do you want us to do?" Brandon met her gaze. "First, we need to reassure our employees. I'll be addressing the team this afternoon to dispel any fears or doubts. Second, we need to get ahead of this in the industry. I'll be reaching out to key clients and partners to reaffirm our stability and commitment." He paused, his tone firm. "And finally, we're going to find out who's responsible. If it's who I think it is, we'll pursue every legal avenue available to hold them accountable." That afternoon, Brandon called another all-hands meeting. The employees gathered nervously, the tension in the air palpable. The rumors from the article had spread quickly, and many were unsure of what to believe. Brandon stood in front of the room, his expression calm but resolute. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I want to address the article that was published this morning." He held up a copy of the article. "This piece is full of lies and misinformation. It's designed to create fear and division, but I want to make one thing clear: Nexus Incorporated is strong, and we are moving forward. He looked around the room, meeting the employees' eyes. I know change can be difficult, and I know there have been challenges over the past few weeks. But I promise you, I am committed to this company and to every one of you. We will not let distractions or lies derail us. Emily was the first to speak up. Thank you, Brandon, she said, her voice steady. I believe in what you're doing. Other employees began to nod, murmuring their agreement. While some still seemed hesitant, the overall mood in the room shifted toward support. After the meeting, Brandon returned to his office, determined to take action. He contacted Nexus Incorporated's legal team and PR consultants, instructing them to draft a formal response to the article. The statement would not only refute the allegations, but also highlight the company's recent successes and future plans. Brandon also made personal calls to key clients, assuring them of the company's stability and addressing any concerns they had. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many expressing their continued confidence in his leadership. Meanwhile, Todd was working in the shadows. He had contacted a disgruntled former employee who had been let go during the transition, feeding them false information to fuel the smear campaign. Todd believed that if he could create enough chaos, Brandon's position would become untenable. But Todd underestimated one thing: Brandon's resilience. By the end of the week, Nexus Incorporated's response to the article had gone public. The statement was concise but powerful, directly addressing the false allegations and reaffirming the company's commitment to its employees and clients. It included testimonials from key partners and employees who supported Brandon's leadership. The industry's reaction was swift. While some skeptics remained, most people saw the article for what it was: a baseless attack. The company's reputation, while slightly bruised, remained intact. As Brandon reviewed the results of the PR campaign, Sarah walked into his office, holding a piece of paper. "Brandon, you're going to want to see this." She handed him the paper, a printed email chain. It was from Todd's personal email account, containing correspondence with the former employee he had recruited for the smear campaign. The emails outlined their plan in detail, including instructions on what false information to share with the media. Brandon's jaw tightened as he read through the emails. This was the evidence he needed. "Thank you, Sarah," he said. "Get Diane and the legal team in here. It's time to put an end to this." As the day ended, Brandon sat in his office, preparing for the next step. Todd had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. While Brandon knew the road ahead would still have challenges, he felt more determined than ever to protect the company and the employees who believed in him. The battle with Todd wasn't just about leadership, it was about principle. And Brandon was ready to fight for what was right. Brandon wasted no time. Armed with the incriminating email chain, he convened a meeting with Diane from HR and the legal team. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but Brandon's calm focus set the tone. "This is the proof we've been waiting for," Brandon said, laying the printed emails on the table. "Todd's actions aren't just unprofessional, they're malicious. He's actively working to sabotage this company." Diane nodded, her face set with determination. "This is more than enough to take legal action. We can issue a cease and desist immediately and prepare a formal complaint for defamation." The company's lead attorney, Mr. Grayson, leaned forward. "We can also pursue damages if the smear campaign caused measurable harm to Nexus Incorporated's reputation or finances." Brandon considered this, his mind racing through the possibilities. He wanted to hold Todd accountable, but he also didn't want a drawn-out legal battle to overshadow the progress the company was making. "Let's start with the cease and desist," Brandon decided. "We'll make it clear that any further actions on Todd's part will lead to legal consequences. In the meantime, let's continue to rebuild trust with our employees and clients." That afternoon, Brandon summoned Todd for a meeting. It was the moment he had been preparing for, and he wanted to face Todd directly before taking any further steps. Todd entered the office with his usual arrogance, though his smirk faltered slightly when he saw the folder of evidence on Brandon's desk. He sat down without being invited, leaning back in his chair as if he still held the upper hand. "You wanted to see me?" Todd asked, his tone laced with defiance. Brandon folded his hands on the desk, his expression calm but firm. "Yes, Todd. I wanted to discuss these." He slid the printed emails across the desk, watching as Todd's eyes flicked over the pages. Todd's face darkened, but he quickly masked his reaction. "I don't know what this is supposed to prove," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "This could have been written by anyone." Brandon leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. They came from your email account, Todd. And we both know what they prove. You've been orchestrating a campaign to undermine me and this company. That's not just unethical, it's illegal. Todd's fists clenched, but he forced a smirk. You think you can scare me with some emails? Go ahead and try. Let's see how much you like the attention when this goes public. Brandon's voice remained steady. This isn't about scaring you, Todd. It's about holding you accountable. I've already contacted our legal team, and a cease and desist is being issued as we speak. If you continue this behavior, you'll face serious legal consequences. For a moment, Todd's bravado cracked. His eyes darted to the folder, then back to Brandon. You're making a mistake, he said through gritted teeth. You think you can get rid of me, but I'm the reason this company is still standing. Brandon stood, his tone final. The only mistake was allowing your behavior to continue for as long as it did. Your time at Nexus Incorporated is over, Todd. The sooner you accept that, the better. Todd stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You'll regret this, he spat before storming out of the office. After Todd's departure, Brandon gathered the team leaders for an update. He didn't go into the specifics of Todd's actions but reassured them that the situation was being handled and that Nexus Incorporated was stronger than ever. Emily, now a senior project manager, stepped forward to address the group. I know this has been a tough time for all of us, she said, her voice steady. But I've seen firsthand how much Brandon cares about this company and its people. We're in good hands, and I believe in the direction we're heading. Her words sparked a ripple of agreement among the team leaders, and Brandon felt a surge of gratitude. The tide was turning, and the support of the employees was a testament to the progress they had made. That evening, Brandon received confirmation that the cease and desist had been delivered to Todd. While the immediate threat was neutralized, Brandon knew Todd wouldn't give up easily. He was a man fueled by pride and resentment, and his next move could be unpredictable. As Brandon sat in his office, reflecting on the day's events, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Emily. Thank you for everything you're doing. You're making a difference, and we've got your back. Brandon smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with the support of people like Emily and the determination of the Nexus Incorporated team, he was ready for whatever came next. For now, Todd's threats had been silenced. But Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that the storm wasn't over yet. Todd had been backed into a corner, and desperate people often made dangerous choices. The days following Todd's abrupt departure brought a noticeable shift at Nexus Incorporated. Without his toxic presence looming over the office, employees seemed more at ease. Conversations were livelier, collaboration improved, and for the first time in weeks, the atmosphere felt optimistic. But Brandon remained cautious. Todd's parting words still lingered in his mind. You'll regret this. It wasn't just bravado. Brandon knew Todd well enough to recognize that he wouldn't go quietly. Todd was too prideful, too determined to prove a point. On Wednesday morning, Brandon's assistant Sarah walked into his office, her expression tense. We've got a problem, she said, placing a tablet on his desk. Brandon looked at the screen, and his stomach sank. It was a new article, this time on a gossip-style industry blog. The headline read, Ex-manager spills the dirt on Nexus Incorporated, chaos, corruption, and cover UPS. The article was filled with sensational claims, most of them outright lies. It painted Brandon as a tyrannical boss who had fired Todd for exposing the truth. It also claimed that the company's recent changes had led to mass employee dissatisfaction and that several high-profile clients were considering cutting ties. Brandon's jaw tightened as he read the article. This wasn't just another smear, it was a direct attack on the company's reputation. Worse, it was gaining traction online, with commenters piling on and sharing their own fabricated experiences with Nexus Inc. Have we confirmed who's behind this? Brandon asked, though he already had a good idea. Sarah nodded grimly. It's Todd. He's been feeding information, or misinformation, to this blog. He's even quoted in the article, though they listed him as an anonymous source. Brandon leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Todd had escalated the fight, and now it was playing out on a public stage. Brandon immediately called an emergency meeting with his PR and legal teams. The mood in the room was tense as they reviewed the article and its implications. This is bad, Mr. Grayson, the company's attorney, said bluntly. The claims are baseless, but the damage to your reputation could be significant. If clients start believing this nonsense, it could hurt your bottom line. What are our options? Brandon asked. We could file a defamation lawsuit, Grayson replied. But that takes time, and it could draw even more attention to the allegations. Our best bet is to issue a public statement refuting the claims and reassuring our stakeholders. Brandon nodded. Let's do both. File the lawsuit to show we're serious, but focus on getting ahead of the narrative. I'll personally reach out to our key clients and partners to address any concerns. That afternoon, Brandon gathered the employees for another all-hands meeting. The article had spread quickly, and the staff was already on edge, worried about what it might mean for the company's future. Thank you all for coming, Brandon began, his tone calm but firm. As many of you know, another article has been published, filled with false allegations about Nexus Incorporated and about me personally. He held up a printed copy of the article. Let me be clear, this is not journalism. It's a smear campaign orchestrated by someone who no longer works here, a person who is unwilling to accept responsibility for their own actions. The room was silent, employees hanging on his every word. I want you all to know that we are taking this seriously, Brandon continued. Our legal team is pursuing action against the individual responsible, and our PR team is working to ensure that the truth is heard. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. But more importantly, I want to assure you that this company is strong. We've faced challenges before, and we've come through them stronger. This will be no different. Emily, sitting near the front, raised her hand. How can we help? She asked. Brandon smiled, grateful for her support. By continuing to do what you do best, showing the world what Nexus Incorporated is really about. Let's focus on delivering great results for our clients and supporting each other as a team. Over the next few days, Brandon worked tirelessly to contain the fallout. He personally contacted clients, assuring them that the allegations were baseless and reaffirming the company's commitment to excellence. His transparency and calm demeanor reassured most of them, and several even expressed their support publicly. Meanwhile, the PR team launched a counter-campaign to highlight Nexus Incorporated's recent successes. They published testimonials from satisfied clients, showcased innovative projects, and shared stories of employee growth and collaboration. The positive messaging began to drown out the negativity, and public perception started to shift. But Todd wasn't finished. On Friday morning, Brandon received an anonymous tip that Todd was planning to leak confidential company information, client contracts, financial data, and internal memos. If the leak happened, it could cause serious damage to Nexus Incorporated's credibility and violate client trust. Brandon acted quickly, convening an emergency meeting with the IT and legal teams. We need to secure our systems immediately, he said. Lock down access to sensitive files, review recent activity logs, and identify any vulnerabilities. The IT manager nodded. We're on it. If Todd's working with someone on the inside, we'll find out. Brandon's heart sank at the thought. Could there be someone within Nexus Incorporated still loyal to Todd, willing to betray the company for him? The possibility added a new layer of urgency to the situation. That evening, as the office emptied out, Brandon stayed behind, reviewing security reports and strategizing next steps. His phone buzzed with a call from Emily. Brandon, I've been hearing some things, she said, her voice cautious. Some of Todd's old allies are still here, and they're not happy about what's happened. I think they might be working with him. Brandon's jaw tightened. Do you have any names? Not yet, Emily replied. But I'll keep my ears open. I just thought you should know. Thank you, Emily, Brandon said. I'll handle it. As Brandon sat alone in his office, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. Todd's actions were relentless, and the possibility of internal betrayal made it even more complicated. But Brandon wasn't about to back down. Nexus Incorporated was worth fighting for, and he was determined to protect the company and the people who believed in him. Whatever Todd's next move was, Brandon would be ready. The battle wasn't over yet, but neither was Brandon.